Man gives homeless girl a coat, unaware she's his sister. A man with a generous heart gives his coat to a homeless woman, unaware she's his long-lost sister. This simple act of kindness reveals an unexpected blood connection. Fate brings them together in a reunion that will change their lives forever. The night was bitterly cold. A thick fog clung to the air, and the neon lights from the nearby streetlights barely cut through the mist. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car speeding by, its headlights flickering like ghosts in the darkness. The chill in the air sliced through her thin, ragged clothes as she huddled against the corner of a run-down building, trying to shield herself from the biting wind. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her knees. Her body hunched forward in a futile attempt to keep warm. The smell of garbage and old pizza crusts wafted in the air, a pungent reminder of the world that had cast her aside. Her stomach growled, empty and hollow, but she hadn't eaten in days. The ache of hunger mingled with the pain of loneliness, the sting of betrayal still fresh on her heart. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the world, but all she could see was the memory of the past. Her breath came out in shaky clouds, visible against the night. She had been abandoned by the only people she had ever loved. Her family, the ones who promised they would never leave her, had turned their backs when she had fallen from grace. The man who had sworn to cherish her, to love her through thick and thin, had discarded her like a broken toy the moment she lost her job. The betrayal was still raw, still festering in her heart. The rejection, the abandonment, they were like open wounds that never healed. She had once been someone important. She had once been loved. Now, she was nothing more than a shadow of herself, wandering the streets with no place to call home. She could almost hear the echoes of her mother's disappointed voice in her mind, telling her how foolish she had been, how she had ruined everything. And then, the silence that followed when the phone calls stopped, the visits ceased. She had become nothing more than a distant memory, a burden that no one wanted to carry. Her fingers brushed against her coat, a meager layer of protection from the freezing night. It was worn thin, the fabric torn in places, and it did little to shield her from the relentless cold. She had once been proud of it, a gift from her late grandmother, but now it was just another reminder of how far she had fallen. The warmth of her memories seemed to have vanished along with her dignity. A figure approached from the fog, a man tall and imposing. His footsteps echoed in the empty street as he neared her, and for a moment she tensed. Was he going to mock her, to look down on her, just like everyone else? The way people crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her, the way they recoiled in disgust. She had become so used to it that she could almost anticipate it. But this man didn't do that. Instead, he stopped in front of her, standing tall and silent for a moment. The warmth of his presence contrasted sharply with the cold that surrounded her. She looked up, her eyes narrow and cautious. His face was kind, his expression filled with concern, and there was something in his gaze that made her hesitate. For the first time in a long while, she felt someone truly seeing her, not as a dirty, discarded figure on the street, but as a person, a human being with feelings. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft yet genuine. She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. She had learned to keep her walls up, to hide the pain beneath layers of indifference. But there was something about this stranger, something different in the way he spoke, that made her want to lower her guard just a little. Just enough to let the slightest bit of hope creep in. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. She didn't want to get close to anyone. Not again. Not after everything. But the man didn't move. Instead, his eyes fell to her coat, the thin, shabby garment that clung to her like a second skin. Without a word, he shrugged off his own coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. It was warm, the fabric thick and comforting, an unexpected kindness in the midst of her desolation. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, his tone steady, as if he truly meant it. And then, just as quietly as he had come, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog. She sat there, stunned, staring at the coat that now enveloped her. Her hands reached up to touch the fabric, and for a moment, she couldn't believe what had just happened. No one had ever done something like this for her. Not in months. Not since the days before everything had fallen apart. The warmth of the coat spread through her, and for the briefest moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long. A flicker of kindness. A reminder that there were still good people in the world. But even as that thought crept into her mind, it was chased away by the familiar pain in her chest, the ache of betrayal, rejection, and abandonment. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, as if it could protect her from the darkness that still lingered in her heart. The man's face, kind and compassionate, kept replaying in her mind, a sharp contrast to the cold indifference of the world she had known. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too good to be true. That kindness was fleeting, just like everything else in her life. But for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible after all. Still, the loneliness gnawed at her insides. The hunger, the desperation, the sting of memories that refused to fade. They were all too much to bear. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cold brick of the building behind her, and wished for a life she couldn't have, a life that had slipped through her fingers the moment she lost everything. In the distance, the man's footsteps faded into the night, leaving behind only the warmth of his coat and the question that lingered in her mind. Who was he? Why had he helped her? And would he ever know how much his simple act of kindness had meant? The man who had given her the coat, though unaware of it, had stepped into a world of pain he could never have imagined. He was a successful businessman, living in a world of luxury and comfort. His life was filled with meetings, deals, and deadlines, a constant whirlwind of expectations and achievements. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. A beautiful home, a well-maintained car, a prestigious job, and the respect of his peers. But beneath the polished surface, his life was not without its struggles. The pressure of his work, the weight of expectations, and the constant striving for perfection had slowly worn him down over the years. He had become a man driven by the need to succeed, but at what cost? His relationships had suffered, and though he had many acquaintances, few truly knew him. He had built walls around himself, shutting out the vulnerability he used to embrace. It had all become about appearances, about keeping up with the demands of the world that expected him to always be on top. But what truly haunted him, what left the deepest scars, were the people he had lost. His sister, the one person he had always been close to, had disappeared from his life years ago. He hadn't seen her since the night she left, when everything fell apart. She had been so full of life, so full of promise. They had been inseparable as children, sharing everything. Dreams, fears, hopes. But that night, she vanished without a trace, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions. He had tried to reach out to bring her back, but she had simply slipped away. She stopped answering his calls. Her apartment, once filled with laughter and light, was now abandoned. Her friends, the ones who had known her best, seemed to have no idea where she went. He had searched for months, putting up posters, calling hospitals, checking shelters, but it was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth. He never understood why she left. They had always been so close, so connected. And then, just like that, she was gone. He had tried to rationalize it, to tell himself that maybe she needed space, or maybe something had happened that he didn't know about. But the hurt, the confusion, the rejection, it had all eaten at him for years. As time passed, the anger faded, replaced by a deep sorrow, a sense of loss that never quite healed. He could never forgive her fully, not without understanding why she had left. The hurt, the abandonment, the feeling of being discarded by his own flesh and blood, it gnawed at him, festering in the corners of his mind. How could someone he loved so dearly just walk away, without a word, without even a goodbye? And yet, there was always a nagging thought in the back of his mind. Had he done something wrong? Was there something he could have done to save her, to keep her from falling into the darkness that had swallowed her whole? Had he been too busy with his own life, too absorbed in his own success, to notice the signs? Or was it all just fate, something they had no control over? That doubt, that uncertainty, kept him awake at night, wondering what might have been if he had just done things differently. It was during one of these long, restless nights that he found himself walking the streets of the city, clearing his mind, trying to escape the constant buzz of his thoughts. That was when he had crossed paths with the woman on the corner. The sight of her, so fragile, so alone, had struck him in a way he couldn't explain. He had tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that she was just another face in the crowd. But something about her had stayed with him, lingering in his mind long after he had walked away. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her before, that there was something familiar about her. But the fog of doubt clouded his thoughts, and he dismissed it, as he often did with things that made him uncomfortable. He had his own life to worry about. Yet, when he had returned to his car that night, he found himself hesitating. The thought of her, sitting there in the cold, had gnawed at him, and so he had turned back. Without thinking, he had taken off his own coat, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the bitter cold that wrapped around him, and placed it over her shoulders. It was a small gesture, one that had felt so natural in that moment. But little did he know, it was a gesture that would set in motion a series of events that neither of them could have ever anticipated. Her name was Emily. She had once been a promising student, a young woman full of dreams and hope for the future. Growing up in a loving home, surrounded by family who cared for her, Emily had always believed that happiness and success were attainable. She had been the type of person who believed in the goodness of people and worked hard to achieve her goals. But life, in its unpredictable and often cruel manner, had a way of knocking her down again and again. The first betrayal had come when she lost her job. She had worked tirelessly at a reputable firm, pouring her heart and soul into her work. She had always believed that dedication and hard work would lead to success, but one mistake, one small, insignificant error, had cost her everything. The company, which she had given so much of herself to, fired her without warning. There was no second chance, no opportunity to explain. Her colleagues, once her friends, turned their backs on her as if she were nothing more than a failure. She had never seen it coming, and the blow was devastating. But it wasn't just her career that crumbled. Her boyfriend, the one person she had relied on the most, had been quick to walk away. He had promised to support her, to be there for her no matter what, and for a time she had believed him. But the moment things got tough, the moment she lost her job, he disappeared. No explanation, no words, just silence. She had begged him to stay, to help her through the difficult time, but he had rejected her just like everyone else. His absence left an aching void, one that no amount of pleading could fill. She was alone. And then there had been her family. Her parents, who had always been her rock, had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. When she called them, desperate for comfort, they had told her to pull herself together, to stop wallowing in self-pity, as if her pain was something to be brushed aside. They had told her that everyone faces hardships, that she just needed to get over it. The rejection from them had been the hardest blow of all. The ones she had always relied on, the people she thought would love her unconditionally, had abandoned her when she needed them most. Each betrayal had hurt more than the last, each wound leaving a scar that was harder to heal. She had tried to pick up the pieces of her life, but with every attempt, it felt like something else was falling apart. The constant pressure to succeed, to prove herself worthy of love and respect, weighed heavily on her. And so, the pain of rejection built up, layer upon layer, until it became an unbearable burden. With no one to turn to, she had retreated into herself, withdrawing from the world and sinking deeper into despair. But she had no choice but to keep moving forward. Survival had become her only option. The world had turned its back on her, and so she had learned to rely solely on herself. She had learned to adapt to the harsh reality that she was alone, that no one would come to her rescue. And though the wounds of betrayal still lingered, they had forged a new, hardened version of herself, one that no longer believed in the kindness of others. When Emily had first found herself on the streets, it had been a shock. One night she had been in her apartment, overwhelmed by bills and the crushing weight of her situation. The next, she found herself alone, with nothing to her name. The world she had once known seemed so far away, a distant memory of a life she could never have again. As she huddled in a corner, trying to escape the bitter cold, she couldn't help but feel invisible, as though she no longer mattered. The coat, when it had been draped around her shoulders by a stranger, was the first act of kindness she had received in what felt like forever. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something other than pain. She pulled the coat tighter around her body, as though it were the first warm embrace she had ever known. She didn't know who he was, this man who had given her his coat without a second thought. But in that brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that there were still people in the world who cared. And yet, as the man disappeared into the mist, a nagging thought lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him before, that there was something about him that was familiar. But the fog clouded her thoughts, and she brushed it aside. What did it matter after all? He was just another stranger, and her life was still broken. She had learned long ago not to expect anything from anyone, not even from those who had once been close to her. What Emily didn't know was that the stranger who had shown her that fleeting kindness was someone she had once known well, someone she would have never expected to cross her path again. As the days turned into weeks, Emily continued to wander the streets. Her life had become a blur of cold nights and empty days. She spent most of her time searching for shelter, food, and warmth, but the world had become a hostile place, one where survival was the only goal. Her once bright future now felt like a distant dream, a fleeting memory that seemed impossible to reclaim. Yet, even in the midst of her suffering, there were moments of clarity, moments where she could almost remember what it felt like to be happy, to be loved. But those memories were like fragile threads, easily broken by the harsh reality she now lived in. She had tried to reach out to her family once more, hoping that time had softened the edges of their anger and disappointment. But the cold reception she had received had shattered her hope once again. Her parents, who had once been her greatest supporters, no longer wanted her. They didn't need her, not when she was just a burden, a failure, someone they had no use for. Their rejection was a knife to her heart, each wound deeper than the last. Every attempt to repair the broken bond between them had been met with silence, with words that stung like acid. The love she had once known seemed like an illusion now, something that had never truly existed. As the weeks dragged on, Emily felt herself becoming more and more invisible to the world. She was just another face on the street, just another lost soul in a city full of them. The people who passed her by didn't look at her, didn't see her. She was nothing more than a shadow, a forgotten person who no longer mattered. She didn't even recognize herself anymore. The girl who had once dreamed of a future filled with hope and ambition had disappeared, replaced by someone who was barely surviving. She had become a ghost, moving through life with no purpose other than to keep going day by day. But in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, she could feel the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. The loneliness was suffocating, filling her chest with a dull ache that never seemed to go away. She could hear the laughter of families and the chatter of friends, and it made her heart ache with longing. She missed the feeling of being loved, of belonging somewhere. But that was a life she would never know again. It was during one of these moments, as she sat huddled in the corner of an alley, trying to keep warm in the thin, tattered clothes she wore, that the man had appeared. He was just another passerby, or so she had thought. She hadn't known his name, hadn't known anything about him. But in that moment, he had done something that no one else had done in a long time. He had seen her. Not as a homeless woman, not as a failure, but as a person. He had given her his coat, without asking for anything in return. The gesture was simple, yet it was more than she had ever expected. For the first time in a long time, someone had shown her kindness. The coat was warm, the fabric soft against her skin. It was the first time in weeks that she had felt something other than cold, other than hunger. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, allowing the warmth to seep into her bones. It wasn't just the physical warmth that comforted her, but the emotional warmth, the sense that, for just a moment, she mattered. She wasn't invisible anymore. Someone cared, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. For a brief second, Emily allowed herself to believe in the possibility of kindness, to believe that there was still hope, that there were still good people in the world. But even then, the pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun it. The loneliness, the rejection, the fear of never being enough. It was all there, waiting to pull her back into the darkness. But for a moment, as the man walked away, disappearing into the distance, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. Little did Emily know that the man who had given her the coat was carrying his own burdens. He had no idea that the woman he had helped was someone from his past, someone he had once loved and lost. Weeks passed, and Emily continued her routine of survival. The streets had become her home, a place where she fought every day to survive, to scrape together enough to eat, to find shelter for the night. Yet amidst all of the hardship, the coat that the man had given her, had become her most prized possession. It wasn't just the warmth it provided, though it certainly helped in the biting cold of the streets. It wasn't just the softness of the fabric, or its ability to shield her from the harsh weather. No, it was something more. It was a symbol of kindness in a world that had mostly forgotten her. It was a reminder that, despite everything, not everyone had abandoned her. There had been at least one person, one stranger, who had seen her as human, who had cared enough to give her something when she had nothing. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to help her push through the difficult days. Then one day, as she walked down the familiar street, she saw him again. The man who had given her the coat. He was walking in the opposite direction, and at first, Emily didn't recognize him immediately. His face was familiar, yes, but it took her a moment to place him. She was still holding the coat tightly around her shoulders, and as he drew closer, something about him seemed so striking, so hauntingly familiar. Her heart began to race. There was a connection there, something she couldn't put her finger on, but it was undeniable. The air around her seemed to thicken with an unexplainable tension, the noise of the street fading away as she focused solely on him. He walked toward her with a steady pace, his eyes scanning the ground ahead. Emily stood frozen, unable to move, caught in some strange pull she couldn't understand. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him if he remembered her, but the words wouldn't come. She could barely breathe as he walked past her, completely unaware of the connection between them. There was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition of the woman standing there, holding the coat he had given her months ago. He continued on his way, disappearing into the crowd of people around them. But just as he was about to turn the corner, something made him pause. His hand moved instinctively to the brim of his coat, adjusting it, as if something had caught his attention. Emily's breath hitched in her chest as she stared at him. And then, in that instant, it hit her like a lightning bolt. She knew him. She didn't know how, but she knew. Her mind raced as the realization washed over her. This man, the stranger who had shown her kindness, was her brother. Her heart stopped. It was as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. For so many years, she had wondered about him, about the brother she had lost all those years ago. She had searched for him in the faces of strangers, but never had she expected to find him here, in this moment, in the very same street she walked every day. Her body shook as she tried to process what had just happened. Her brother, the person she had once loved and lost, was standing right in front of her, and yet, he didn't recognize her. He didn't remember her at all. The pain of that realization hit her like a wave. All those years of feeling abandoned, all the questions she had carried with her, now seemed to be answered in the cruelest way possible. Her brother had moved on. He had forgotten her. But even as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, Emily couldn't bring herself to confront him. She couldn't reach out, couldn't call his name. What would she even say? After everything, after all the years, how could she explain who she was? And more importantly, how could she face the brother who had forgotten her, who had no idea who she was, even as he had been the one to save her from the cold? She watched him disappear around the corner, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions, sadness, longing, and the bitter sting of loss. She was left standing there, clutching the coat to her chest, a symbol of a past she could never reclaim. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. All the years of pain, abandonment, and rejection, It had all led to this moment. Her brother, the man who had once been her everything, was right there in front of her, and yet, he didn't recognize her. It was like a dream, a cruel twist of fate that she couldn't escape. Emily had spent so long resenting him, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. She had blamed him for leaving her behind when their family fell apart, for not reaching out when she needed him the most. But in that moment, as she stood there staring at his retreating figure, something shifted in her. She wanted to run to him, to cry out for him to see her, to understand her, to scream out all the years of hurt and confusion. She wanted to remind him of the sister he had once loved, the sister he had once been so close to. She wanted him to know the woman she had become, stronger, scarred, but alive. But instead, she stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The pain was unbearable, but there was a part of her that realized the truth. The true betrayal hadn't just come from him. It had come from herself. She had let the pain of the past define her, to control her actions and her emotions. She had spent all these years carrying around the burden of anger, resentment, and hurt. She had allowed the actions of others, including her brother's absence, to shape her sense of self-worth. In a way, she had been holding on to the past, letting it fester and define her, rather than moving forward. But now, as she stood there, the weight of her past pressing down on her, she realized that the time had come to release it. She wasn't that broken girl anymore. She was stronger, braver, and more resilient than she had ever been. The pain of the past would no longer hold her back. She had survived it, endured it, and come out the other side. And most importantly, she had learned how to survive on her own. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even her brother, define who she was or what her life could be. As Emily watched him disappear around the corner, her mind started to clear. She had spent too much time wishing for a reunion, longing for answers, and hoping for things to be different. But she understood now that she couldn't change the past. What mattered now was what she chose to do with her future. It was in her hands. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and that was something her brother couldn't take away from her. She took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to forgive. Not for him but for herself. She needed to release the bitterness, the anger, and the resentment. She had held on to those emotions for far too long, and they had only weighed her down. It wasn't easy, but Emily understood that forgiveness wasn't about absolving anyone else of their wrongs. It was about freeing herself from the chains of her past. And so, Emily made her way down the street, away from the man who had once been her brother. She wasn't running from him. She was running toward a new future. She was finally letting go of the past, the abandonment, the pain, the rejection, and walking into the unknown, ready to create a new life for herself. The world may have rejected her, but in that moment, she realized that the only validation she needed was from herself. And she was ready to build a life on her own terms. With each step she took, Emily felt lighter, freer, and more at peace than she had in years. The pain of the past no longer held any power over her. And for the first time in a long time she felt hope again.